by 1943, there were 150,000 roughly Canadian troops in England, and they had been gathered there and became a solid core of 1st Canadian Army. And the purpose of the army was envisioned to be a major part of the invasion of Normandy, which at that time they didn't know for sure they were going to invade Normandy, but they were going to invade somewhere on the French coast, hopefully in 1944. And so that was the plan. So the plan was to keep 1st Canadian Army whole so that it could participate in that invasion and be actually a primary player in the invasion. But things by 1943, Canada's army has fought in only 2 operations, being the Battle of Hong Kong and Dieppe, of course. And both of those ended disastrously, as we know. And so there was mounting pressure in 1943 as the Battle of the Atlantic got hotter and the operations of Bomber Command going into Germany were being more intensive. Losses were really high amongst Bomber Command. And of course, the Battle of the Atlantic was also taking quite a lot of casualties from the naval service. So back at home, there became increasing calls by politicians, the newspaper editors, and old veterans of World War I to get the Canadian Army doing something. And they didn't really care what, just as long as they went and fought somewhere. So that was kind of the what was happening as we moved into January and February of 1943. Lieutenant General Harry Crerar, who was commanding the 1st Canadian Corps at that time, was also a really vocal war hawk. And he had a lot of influence because he was a best friend of Alan Brooke, who was the head of the Chief of the Imperial General Staff. And so he had quite a lot of sway there. And also the defense minister back in Ottawa, Ralston, was very influential with that person as well. And Crerar was pushing a lot for some kind of employment. As the North African campaign winds down, then it becomes clear that the next operation is going to be somewhere in probably the invasion of Sicily. And Prime Minister Mackenzie King asks Churchill, can we have a role in the next operation? And the British agree, and 3rd British Infantry Division is switched out for the 1st Canadian Infantry Division. And so that's really how it all happens, that we end up heading off to sunny Italy. So initially 1 division, and the 1st Canadian Tank Brigade, as it's known at that time, it's redesignated during the Sicily campaign as 1st Canadian Armored Brigade, are going. So roughly 20,000 to 21,000 troops committed and taken away from 1st Canadian Army. The hope at this point, particularly the hope of the general in command of 1st Canadian Army, McNaughton, is that they will come back after Sicily, that they will be returned. And so that's the kind of hope that's happening. They'll get some battle experience in Sicily, come back, be part of 1st Canadian Army for the invasion of Normandy that will be forthcoming.
Okay.
So that's kind of the background of where we go.
So really, it's not unlike Dieppe, where they just wanted to get fighting somewhere. A lot of politicians pressure. So let's get into it. No matter, let's get some action.
It's really the scenario all over again.
Yeah.
that led to Dieppe. They did, because of the Dieppe raid, King did say that McNaughton had to be able to look at the invasion plan and approve it, which he did. And surprisingly, he approved it in 2 hours. So So either it wasn't as extensive a plan as the Dieppe raid, which runs hundreds of pages,
Right.
or he just picked up the highlights. And it does look a lot when you look at the operation scene. It is a good plan. It's a sea change from Dieppe. We're looking at heavy naval bombardment participation from battleships and heavy monitors, an enormous amount of air power being thrown against the island, basing out of Malta and North Africa. Canadian squadrons are present there in the bombing and that. So it is a better plan. They're also it's a much better beach arrangement. The beaches are fairly close. The British beach is just down the way from Bark West, where the Canadians will land.
Okay.
So it's they're able to support each other, and those naval ships are able to bombard both beaches with a fair amount of degree of accuracy. So a much different plan. The Americans will be landing to the left of the Canadians with the U.S. 7th Army under General George Patton. And we're part of 8th Army under General Bernard Montgomery. And Montgomery was happy with this arrangement because he had commanded the Canadians in southern England up until he was sent to North Africa. And so he's familiar with the Canadian troops and the Canadians' training. He knows they're a competent division. The Major General commanding 1st Canadian Infantry Division is killed flying to Cairo as the plane crashes en route. His name was Salmon, and he is replaced then by Major General Guy Simmons, who ultimately will become a very key player as commander of 2nd Canadian Corps through Normandy and up through the liberation of Holland.
Okay.
Whereas Montgomery hates Crerar, Montgomery likes Simmons a lot. He actually considers Simmons to be a bit of a protege. Simmons, in turn, does see Montgomery as his mentor. They both wear the black beret of the tank regiments, even though neither of them have served in a tank regiment, but it becomes a bit of a trademark. So this is good. Simmons is a general that Montgomery feels very comfortable having under his command, and believes that he will acquit himself very well in the invasion of where we are. So we went to Sicily in a very large convoy. 250 ships roughly in the convoy. They sailed in 2 phases. There was what was called the slow convoy, which set off first. It had the equipment and some personnel, but ones who would be landed after the actual invasion occurred. Then there was the fast convoy, which carried 1st Canadian Infantry Division, and it would sail later, but arrive at the beaches the same time as the slow convoy. That was the plan. The landings at Bark West, initially they were very worried. They thought that the casualties were going to be really high. They were remembering Dieppe, and the British also expected the casualties to be very high. The beaches were defended by Italians, coastal defense divisions, which were known to be of pretty poor quality, but if you got bunkers and you got machine guns and you're just sitting there waiting for people to come across the sand, you can be pretty poor and still be effective. Right. And so they were afraid that there was going to be this slaughter on the beach, but they pretty much figured they would get ashore and they would win the beach. But they were looking, there's 3 brigades in an infantry division. They were contemplating that they might lose an entire brigade. Wow. Just getting ashore. So that would have been, several thousand men. Wow. As it turned out, when British General Oliver Leese told Simmons, "Don't worry, the Italians, when we fight them in North Africa, they put up a short flurry of gunfire and then they surrender or run away." And that's exactly what happened when the Canadians came ashore at Bark West. And part of that was they had been battered heavily by the British destroyers, battleships, monitors, and bombed. So they were of poor morale. They didn't want to be fighting the war anymore. Italy at this point is pretty much starting to look at trying to get out of the war. And then they surrender shortly after the Italian campaign or the Sicily campaign ends. So they get a shore fine. The advance inland initially goes incredibly fast because it's, again, still Italian troops. They're taking, their biggest problem is just taking all the prisoners because there's like, several thousand surrender. And a lot of the troops were from Sicily, the Italian troops, and a lot of them, those ones who were from Sicily, a lot of them, they just went home. They just tossed the gun, got home, got out of their uniform, and went back to being farmers. And so, and the Italian government's at this point paralyzed, so it can't actually enforce anything on, take any kind of revenge against them or anything like that, charge them with desertion or whatever. So the advance goes fairly quickly. The Germans had 2 divisions in Sicily at that time. They beef it up with another division shortly. But because they didn't know where the invasion was going to happen, they kept them in the mountains with the idea that they would come forward once the Allies were assured. And so that is what happens is about the 15th of July, our advance is now coming into the mountains in the interior, and we meet the Germans, and the war gets suddenly very serious for the Canadians. These are good divisions. One of them was the Hermann Göring division. So it was very well trained. The other one was not as well trained, but pretty good. And then first Fallschirmjäger division, which is a parachute division, comes in after that. And they're probably the best division in Italy, and the Canadians will face them at least 5 times in the Italian campaign. It was sort of like wherever the Canadians went, they were sent. And we'll get into why later. And so the fighting goes, there's a lot of hilltops that have to be taken as they move up through the mountains. And the British on the 8th Army side, the right side, had been driving up what's called the Catania Plain, which is to the east of Mount Etna, the big volcano. And they were headed for Messina because there's the narrow straits of Messina there. And if they could reach Messina, they could cut off the ability of the Germans to escape from Sicily. That's the real objective here now. But the Germans managed to stalemate the British on the Catania Plain, just south of Catania, the city. So Montgomery, who had been envisioning 1st Canadian Infantry Division just being kind of screening the left flank of 8th Army, now gives the Canadians the leading role. They have to keep driving the Germans hard on the west side of Mount Etna, with the idea of leeching off German forces from in front of Montgomery's troops in the Catania Plain. And eventually then they can break through and get to Messina. So the Canadian role in the operation now becomes important and decisive. So we fight a lot of really heavy battles. We can't go into all the details of that and actually look at the Italian campaign. But the main one is there's a 905 meter, I think it is, mountain called Monte Asoro, which the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment attacked. The only way of getting up that hill was on a switchback road that goes up to the summit. The Germans had that extremely well covered. The west side of the hill, it's quite almost a sheer cliff. Just cut out terraces for where they had vineyards running that had been cut out hundreds of years ago. So the Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment realizes if they go up the road, they're going to die. So they go over to the right-hand side, the west side of the thing at night, and they climb at night the cliff face. And there's a small unit that leads the way of 5 officers and about almost 100 men. And amongst those people is Lieutenant Farley Mowat, who we all know. And he wrote of it that they managed to get all the way up to the summit without the Germans detecting. Nobody dropped a gun or made noise or anything that gave them away. And Mowat called it the night of where every man had a private miracle of his own. Because of what they achieved. They got to the summit, they attacked the Germans from behind, they took the summit, they held it for 3 days against counterattacks by the Germans, because this was a pivotal summit. Germans lose that, they lose a whole big whack of Sicily.
Okay.
And so they won the battle. The Hastings and Prince Edward Regiment gets relieved eventually by the 48th Highlanders. And Ross Munro, the journalist, said it was the most significant battle of the campaign. Actually, same thing too, that when they won Monte Asoro, the Germans no longer could think of holding Sicily. They would start, the end game begins. So that's kind of the way, and the campaign just carries on like that, with fighting for one hill town after another. The town of Jura falls roughly July 26th, I think. And on July 30th, the Seaforth Highlanders make world fame because their pipe and drum band played the retreat in the central square of Jura. And that performance was recorded by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's journalist, Peter Stursberg. And it was broadcast worldwide. And it was the first broadcast by Allied media out of what was originally Fortress Europe of the Germans. So it was a huge propaganda victory. So that it remains quite significant. And the Seaforths have been back to Jura twice now and recreated the performance, which is always kind of significant to see. And they did that in Operation Husky 2013, and we were all there when they did that. That was the first time they did it. They've been back one other time since.
That's pretty cool.
And so it is. There were actually people in 2013. There were people in the Jura citizens who said they remembered the original performance.
Oh wow!
They had been kids and stuff at that time, and of course, so the campaign ended on August the 2nd. Our part in it, because the Canadians were at one point, we didn't need to keep going, so we stood down on the slopes of Mount Etna on the west side at a town called the Durano, and that was the end of our campaign. They lost about 485 Canadians were killed in that operation, including those soldiers who died at sea. And most of them are buried at the Jura Canadian War Cemetery, which is just outside of the town of Jura. And in the old days, when I first visited that cemetery, it would be 2007, I think it was. Francis and I were staying in Jura, and it was Remembrance Day, and we walked down to the cemetery. And we were the first people who had been in the cemetery in 3 months. The entire year, it was only maybe about 40 people who had been there, and all of the other people who'd been there were Italians. Okay. So just locals. So that has changed a lot ever since Operation Husky 2013. There's always several hundred Canadians who visit the cemetery now. So then there was, once the campaign stops, Sicilia campaign's over, the Canadians and everybody else are resting in Sicily. We get back to the idea of, are the Canadians going to go back to England? And the answer is no. Okay. Montgomery has no intention of letting 1st Division go anywhere except with 8th Army, because he was very impressed with their battle ability, their fighting ability. And there was a question too. It would have taken, again, 250 ships to take them back to England, and they weren't willing. Those ships were not available. Not if they were going to be invading the mainland Italy. And that was part of the thing, is there had been some question as to, was Sicily a one-off and you'd just take Italy, just take Sicily, and it would then provide a very good airfield base for bombing the rest of Italy and up into Austria and even into southern Germany, which they do immediately. And that would be all they would do, thus concentrating their forces again for the invasion of Normandy. But the British, Churchill and Brooke particularly, had always had in their mind that they wanted to invade the Italy mainland. The Americans were less keen because they saw it as a diversion. But Churchill had a theory that he called Italy the soft underbelly of Europe. And he had this vision that we could march up Italy, break into Austria, and be right in the heart of the German area. Italy is anything but a soft underbelly. It's really like a great big bony spine, because of the Apennines running up it. So the strategically, Italy, the Apennines do go all the way up most of Italy, and then they dogleg at the top over to join the French Alps. And so you can't move troops up the center of the country because of the mountains. So you can only go up the east-west sides where there are these narrow plains, and they're quite narrow. They're only a few, a dozen, 20 kilometers wide. And that's where you've got to do your advancing, is up there. So it's always going to be, and then there's all these rivers that flow out of the Apennines to go to the respective seas on either side of Italy. And so when you have river after river after river, you're providing extremely good defensive positions to the Germans. So Italy is now out of the war. They surrender on September 8th. And the Germans take over Italy to prevent the Allies advancing easily up it. So that's the basic scenario there. By September 3rd, we have started to invade mainland Italy at Reggio Calabria. We crossed the Straits of Messina to do that. And so the Canadians are ashore along with 8th Army, and the advance begins up the coasts respectively. So the Americans are primarily on the west coast. British strength is primarily on the east coast, with some overlap of British troops onto the west coast, because the west coast is going to be the main line of advance, and the east coast a little more secondary line of advance. And that brings us up the coast. They had hoped for a really fast advance to Rome, but they start in September. By late November, they've only reached the British are just taking the Sangro River, which is about 40 kilometers south of Ortona. So things are not going well. We're now moving into winter. And winters in Italy, we, as tourists, we all try to go to Italy in the summer and early fall and late spring. And part of the reason for that is because Italy has really lousy winters, an awful lot of rain. The further north you go, it gets cold. And the rain in 1943 was huge, the amount of rain that was falling. So the rivers were quite swollen. The roads in Italy at this time, in southern Italy, are very badly maintained, badly developed, often one lane wide, not anything envisioned as a battlefield. And so that brings the Canadians up to Ortona, which is probably, the most well-remembered battle now that Canadians fought in Italy. It's one that I think is pretty much in the Canadian vision of their memory of World War II, depending on how extensive your knowledge is. Most people will have heard of Ortona, at least at this point. That wasn't the case 25 years ago, but it is, I think, is now. And one of the reasons we remember Ortona is it was incredibly hard fighting there. When the Canadians fought their way into the town, and it was the Loyal Edmonton Regiment and the Seaforth Highlanders and the Three Rivers Tank Regiment that do the fighting inside the town, it was house to house battle. It's actually the only house to house major street battle that Canadians fight in World War II.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So in Northwest Europe, they never had that kind of a battle. There was a small fight in the city of Groningen in Holland, but it wasn't as intense as this because the Germans weren't planning on holding. It was the first parachute division again is who they were fighting in Ortona, and these guys were good. They had a lot of knowledge from the fighting in Stalingrad that had preceded this battle. So they knew how to create urban defenses. And so what they did is they blew down houses and created these big rubble piles that they could put their machine guns in. And they dug out under the buildings or found basements that existed that they could then put machine guns in and be firing out at ground level. In the municipal hall of Ortona, they actually removed the big clock. That most municipal halls in Italy have a big clock where people can then see the time of day, predating when people had watches. And so they removed that and actually put machine guns in that gap. And your main street there is the Corso Emanuele after the king. And it kind of descends towards the municipal hall, not steeply, but a slow descent. And so positions like that, perfect for the German defenders because they're now, you're coming down, they're shooting up. The street becomes it's like a shooting gallery. So movement on the streets is extremely deadly, which is what the Canadians are finding. So the Canadians started doing a tactic that they called mouse holing. And what they did is they would go into a building and capture the buildings in Ortona were all interconnected. So each building had a wall adjoining the next building and the next building. And so they were like large townhouse complexes, if you will. So they would get into one room and they would put explosives against the wall, and then they would back out of the room, set off the explosives, blow a hole in the wall, and then go through throwing grenades in. And so the battle gets really intense and vicious at this point because the Germans start doing things like putting explosives on the other side of the wall. And so when the Canadians come bursting in, they actually blow up the building that the Canadians are coming into, thus burying the Canadians that are inside. So the Battle of Ortona ends December 29th. The Germans more or less just slip away in the night. And one guy, Lieutenant Alan Johnson, who's at Loyal Edmonton, he does an early morning patrol towards the German lines, and there's nobody there. And actually, there's an Italian civilian who comes up to him and says, "What took you so long?" And they're like, "Oh, okay." And so Ortona gets taken, but it's the end of December. The weather is really bad, and Eighth Army just stands down at this point because to continue going forward is pretty much impossible. And at that point, the Canadian presence in Italy is changing as well. First Division is now joined by 5th Canadian Armored Division and the 1st Canadian Corps headquarters. So it becomes one half of 1st Canadian Army is now in Italy. It's not exactly a half because 3 divisions remain in Britain. 2 divisions are now in Italy. So our role expands as we are now a major part of 8th Army. And part of that was because Eighth Army had been fighting in North Africa and then in Italy, and those divisions were wearing out. The famed Desert Rats, for example, they actually stand them down and would send them back to England to rebuild because they're in such bad shape.